This is OpenLine.
Hello everyone, welcome to OpenLine. I am Ben Hall. Good show tonight. We are talking about the horrible situation in the wake of Hurricane Matthew. The Red Cross is on the ground. 75 plus workers from the Tennessee region are all across the Southeast helping out. Major problems across the Southeast. Also, major humanitarian crisis unfolding in Haiti. We want to talk about all of that. Happy to have with us Joel Sullivan, the Regional Chief Executive Officer of the American Red Cross in the Tennessee region. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Ben.
All right, so what's the situation in Southeast United States, North Carolina, South Carolina? What's the situation right now?
The situation right now is still dire straits, especially in the North Carolina area where there's significant flooding. All of the rain that dropped over the weekend from Hurricane Matthew was in the mountains, is now draining out, coming down very few rivers in North Carolina and South Carolina. So those cities are flooding. We've seen pictures of Lumberton and other communities there that those rivers are cresting at record levels, and they're also going to keep high until the end of the week probably before they start receding a little bit, and then the disaster flows all the way down through South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. So it's a very vast, expansive disaster.
So how does this, it seems like we've seen, you probably get this all the time, it seems like we've seen a lot of disasters. How does this rank, and are we seeing more disasters here recently, last few years? I mean, what would you say to that?
Well, this ranks very high on the disaster level. You know, Louisiana just flooded for the second time this year, a month and a half ago. And we have now you have Florida that's been affected, Georgia, South Carolina, Hilton Head, all the way into North Carolina and Virginia, and you have deaths with it. So it's a very significant event, and it's far from being over. The news may not show it on out days after the disaster, but it is continuing. There are still 4,800 people this morning in shelters, in 90 shelters, that woke up in a shelter because they have nowhere else to go.
Wow. And do you feel like we're seeing more disasters? Is it worse last few years?
I think it's picked up. This has been one of our busiest years. We had a couple of years, nationally speaking, that we didn't have as many disasters, but this year has been a tremendous year for disasters. If you think about it, the Tennessee volunteers for our Red Cross, for our region, have been in like 6 states already this year. They've been to California for the wildfires. They've been to Canada for the floods. They've been to Indiana for the tornadoes. I believe Iowa had floods a few weeks ago. Now they're in South Carolina, North Carolina, Florida, Georgia. So it's a busy year, and that doesn't even take into account the volunteers that are working right now across the state and across the nation responding to house fires.
Right, you all do that, and we'll talk more about that.
Right.
All right, so the Hurricane Matthew, you know it's coming. What kind of goes into how you all respond? So at what point do these 75 people get called up, and how does that whole process work where they're actually deployed?
It's a great process when you begin volunteering with the Red Cross, because 93% of what we do is done by volunteers. So when you begin volunteering with the Red Cross, you go through our new member orientation, and you learn kind of the ways of the Red Cross, our mission, our values, principles. And once you learn that, you specialize in different areas. So that could be sheltering, it could be mental health, it could be health services, caseworkers, a myriad of volunteer positions, and you start training in those areas. And once you're trained up, you start training in the other areas so that you know how you're going to fit into the puzzle when the puzzle starts. So take Hurricane Matthew, for instance. We constantly we constantly track hurricanes and bad weather and flooding and tornado outbreaks, so we get as much notice as we can. Well, the volunteers, because of their passion, they stand up and like, hey, something might happen, we may be called. So they kind of almost self-stand up.
Right.
Then we start posting information on our information sources so that they know Hurricane Matthew is coming, be prepared, because we like for them to go when they're called. And they usually have their bags packed and ready to go because they have the passion for the response in helping their fellow citizens. And that's the preparedness phase of it. So you prepare for a disaster, then you respond to it, and then you recover from it. Mm-hmm. So in Louisiana, we're recovering, so that's a different process than the response phase. And so right now, those volunteers that are 3,000 plus volunteers on the East Coast, they're out there right now responding. So they're opening shelters, they're making sure the feeding, the clothing, the mental health is taken care of, the disaster assessment. You know, often once disaster strikes, how do you know how many people were affected? Well, the Red Cross goes in with their volunteers, and they go in and go through the neighborhoods and find out how many homes are damaged or destroyed, how many people are affected, because we need that number as quick as we can to know how many people to feed and shelter.
I'm fascinated by it. So this mainly volunteers, and so they see Hurricane Matthew. I mean, we saw the predictions; it was going to come up the East Coast,
Right.
And they are alerted that they're probably going to have to go. Then what do? They get in their car and go, or do you provide transportation, or how do you get these workers there?
The disaster always starts locally, and that starts with our disaster action teams. So in Nashville, we have several disaster action teams made up of usually 3 or 4 people who, when a disaster strikes, say a home fire, they get called, they go help the people. If they get to a scene, say a tornado has struck, they get to the scene and they say, wow, this is big. Then they call in reinforcements. And so we call out more disasters concentrically, and then if it's bigger than the chapter can handle, because the Nashville area chapter is 9 counties, we have all those volunteers. If we need more, we go out into our region, which is the state.
Okay.
And then if it gets huge, like our flood in 2010, then we call the nation.
And that's what's happened with Hurricane Matthew.
Right.
And you're over, all right, so you're Tennessee region.
Correct.
So that's the whole state.
That's the whole state, and a little bit of Mississippi and a little bit of Arkansas in the Memphis metropolitan statistical area.
And then, so you all get the call. At what point do you get the call from Hurricane Matthew to go out there?
The call came in this case, hurricanes are, if you could say there's something best about it, the best thing is we knew it was coming, so we could prepare. So we staged a lot of folks in Tallahassee. So we sent them down in carpools and convoys, and if we have to fly people, sometimes we'll fly people into those areas so that they're already on the ground ready to go, but far enough away from danger that they don't themselves become victims of disaster.
And what should someone expect if they volunteer? How long are they going to be there? Where are they going to sleep? And what are they going to eat? I mean, so if somebody says, I want to be one of these 75 plus people that responds there in South Carolina and North Carolina, they have to go through some training, like you said. What's the process? Somebody out there right now is watching and they say, I want to respond to I want to help. What's the process?
Well, the beauty is, first, you volunteer and you learn how to respond to disasters in an area that interests you. Whether it's hooking up computer equipment, operating shelters, doing feeding, driving the emergency response vehicles. Once you identify that, you get prepared for it. Then we make the call. We need volunteers. Then we send those volunteers the information, and do they have the physical capacity to do that? And if they don't respond well in very hot environments, we ask them not to go because it could be very hot and sweaty.
Sure.
And once they accept a position, then we deploy them. We give them a card so they can buy incidentals while they're on the disaster. And once they get there, they check in as a volunteer at the disaster headquarters. At headquarters, it usually takes about a day to process you in, figure out where you're going, where the need is greatest, and then we deploy you to that position. And you man your post there with whatever it may be. Now, you may go as a feeding volunteer and end up as a shelter volunteer. And then, depending on your post and your hours of operation, you come back to the staff shelter, and that's where the staff sleeps, along with eating and feeding, and of course we eat out in the field as too. And one of the cool things about being out in the field is we're not only feeding the disaster victims, or as we call them, clients. We're feeding the clients, but we're also feeding the power guys and the gas line guys and anybody that needs to get the infrastructure up and running, because the closer they stay to the field, the quicker their operation is.
And how long do you think they'll be out there? How long should they be prepared to be out there?
A volunteer commits to 2 weeks. And we have some that don't want to come home, so they stay a little bit longer. We've had them deployed as long as 6 weeks.
That's very interesting. Okay, that kind of sets the table. And you responded to Baton Rouge and all the flooding down there in Louisiana. We'll talk about that. But, all right, Jay and others, if you're on the line, hold on. We're going to take a break. Then we're going to come back. I'll take some calls. If you want to call, there's several lines open, 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. Take a break. We'll be back right after this.